Al.
Hey, Donna.
Looking forward to this chat.
Yeah, me too. Me too. We were talking about spontaneity.
Yeah, I wonder if I can read the definition.
I've loved that. You read it to me early, and I thought it was just spot on. So go for it.
The dictionary is referring to spontaneous, proceeding from natural feeling or native tendency without external constraint, arising from a momentary impulse, controlled and directed internally, self-acting, spontaneous movement characteristics of living things. I love that.
Yeah, it's a good definition. And a lot of it fits with how we think about spontaneity in the Feldenkrais method.
Yes, and I think that was Dr. Feldenkrais's idea of being mature and fully human, to be able to act without constraint, within a range that's healthy, whatever that means. But we could also, talk about what is healthy. But being able to act on oneself's own accord without being worried about what other people think or all of the kinds of cultural constraints that we have that dictate our behavior.
It's an interesting idea. And it seems like there's probably, I'm going to say, a range of spontaneity, because there's always like some kind of constraint externally, maybe internally. I mean, your behavior in a church or a synagogue or a mosque is going to be different than if you're at a concert or if you're just in your home with your significant other. So what is spontaneous in those situations? One may be spontaneous in one situation, would be really culturally appropriate, but another, not so much. So it's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it?
It is. So you're saying that being spontaneous is also driven by the context that we're in.
Yeah. There's going to be some kind of constraint in that. So it's like when you're really spontaneous, like, what does that feel like? What do you do? And does that change from context to context for you?
Well, as you're speaking, my mind is generating a bunch of examples. So I'm thinking about walking down the street, for example. If I see a beautiful flower, I might spontaneously pick the flower or not, depending on whether or not I think that particular neighbor would be angry with me for picking a flower in their garden. If I were in a field of flowers in the woods, I would pick flowers. So it's like we have an impulse to do something, and then we often check it from our cultural upbringing. It seems to me like we check our impulses often when it's not necessary, that becomes a compulsion.
Yeah. So like having internalized somebody like a parent or an authority figure, and always running through our current situation through what you think that person might be judging or making some kind of criticism about what we're doing. So having that kind of check. So that kind of it really dampens what you're doing. You have to filter it through that. And that really takes the spontaneity out of things.
Yeah, because you think about the consequences immediately rather than going with that sense of, I want to pick a flower, or if you're cooking, you're adding a new spice. Sometimes we don't add a spice because we're afraid that it's not going to be flavorful, or somebody's going to be at the table that doesn't like cumin, for example, whatever it is. And so we're so often going to the consequence of our behavior rather than feeling the freedom of our own actions.
And there's a lot of situations that we cultivate in Feldenkrais lessons, and people have experiences, when they've been doing Feldenkrais lessons for a while, of having a spontaneous change, where something happens where they had been limited before. Say, I work with a lot of older adults. Well, actually, all my clients are older adults. And so they have, over the years, developed some limitations. Things are difficult, walking or reaching or something like that. And they'll often come back to me and they'll report, wow, I reached up in the cabinet the other day and it was easy. It was just so easy. That's another example of like a spontaneous change somebody made by doing Feldenkrais lessons. Or if somebody falls, they fall in a better way. They have a better reaction to falling, and so they have a spontaneous way of organizing themselves. When they fall safely. And so that's another way to look at spontaneity. It's like when you start to re-pattern, re-educate the brain and the nervous system, you have more ability to respond to things in a way that's really more harmonious with your whole being.
You're bringing up another way to look at spontaneity, one that is, there's freedom in falling down comfortably. There's a way to be safe in the way that you fall down and get up, or reach for that matter, bend over. So those movement activities become comfortable, and there's freedom in that. And there's also a sense of self-trust that comes with that, self-reliance, so that you know that you can engage in certain behaviors and that you'll fall down and get up safely. Or maybe if you're riding a bicycle, you'll tilt a little too far and you'll right yourself. You'll come back up. You'll balance more evenly and quickly, rather than excluding activities. As you get older, you're talking about working with elder people, which I think probably some people would think of us as elders.
What?
I mean, at what point do you become an elder, Al?
I don't know. I felt like an elder in the last couple of years a few times.
Yeah, this morning my husband was saying, it's so interesting being older because I feel like a teenager most of the time. How do we make sense out of this aging process?
Good question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had some pretty interesting experiences having moved back from New Mexico and interacting with younger people. And I have to remember, how did people in their 60s look to me when I was in my 20s?
Old.
Yeah, they looked old. I don't think we look that old. But of course, we're in our 60s looking at 60-year-olds. We look at 20-year-olds, they're like kids.
Yeah. And some of them look so young. 18, yes. 25. Oh my gosh. And if young people are listening to us, appreciate your youth, right? So as we get older, spontaneous behavior sometimes becomes less frequent because people are afraid of the consequences, socially and physically.
And there's just the whole concept of getting older, where people accept or expect to become more limited in their movement. And so if something happens, if they do fall, or they do get injured or something like that, they tend to take that as an indication of that. And they accept that. They don't have to, because you can do what we do, Feldenkrais lessons, you can really maintain your youthfulness and your vitality. As I mentioned before we got online, we bought a new house. I've been outside swinging the pickaxe, digging up sod and digging holes for shrubs and things like this. And it feels great. I do not feel like an old man while I'm doing that.
Yeah, it makes me think about lifting babies out of their cribs. My grandchildren are now 8 months. They're pretty heavy. They're at least 20 pounds, maybe a little bit more. And they're standing up, pulling themselves up. So my kids have lowered the mattress so that I have to reach over the side of the crib. They don't drop the side of the crib like in the old days when I had babies for some reason. You lean over and pick the baby up out of the crib. So to do that, I take a wide stance, I bend my knees, and I mobilize my whole self so that when I'm lifting these babies, I'm secure and I'm not going to injure my back. I don't really have difficulties with my back, but I know that I could have if I were to lift them in a disorganized fashion. So how we use ourselves over time really matters. And, one of the strategies, and I Maybe some of our listeners are standing, or they could stand up if they want to. But if you're going to bend over, and maybe you can play with this, Al, create a wide stance, wider than usual, and then bend your knees and stick your tail out behind you. And notice how you lower your chest downward by sticking your tail out and bending your knees. That's it. So if you were to do anything, if you're gardening, or if you're going to pick up a piece of paper, if you've dropped something on the floor and you need to bend down, and you widen your stance, stick your tail out, bend your knees, your hip joints are engaged, and it's much easier to go down and up like that. And if you feel safe doing so, bring your feet closer together and start to bend down, and notice how you bend down. It's not as easy. Each of us has to find our ideal, when to have the feet closer together and how wide to have them. If you reduce the effort and notice your breathing and pay attention to yourself while you're doing something like that, it protects you from injury. And the more you do it, then it becomes spontaneous. So this is one of the things that we do, as you know, in our Feldenkrais lessons.
When the brain and the nervous system get a way of doing something that's easier, more comfortable, and safer, it's going to adapt it. And it's going to be a spontaneous adaptation, a spontaneous integration of that. And most people just find the delight when they're doing their usual routine, their usual activity, and that thing that had been difficult becomes easier. That's not only for older people too, but if you're a active person, an athlete, a runner, or a young parent, or something like this, those things happen for people of all ages. Because everybody has some kind of limitation or constraint. They have compulsions in their behavior. And when you make these changes through Feldenkrais lessons, you'll find that no matter what your age or what you're doing, that somehow it gets easier. And that's a beautiful, spontaneous, natural thing that happens from doing Feldenkrais lessons.
It's so true. Yeah, I'm thinking about the application of what we're talking about. And I have a new puppy. We've had her for a week. So she's 9 weeks old. She's pretty small, but she's getting up there in weight too. In 1 week, I don't know how much she's gained, but she's a golden retriever, so she's at least 20 pounds, maybe more. And she likes to tip over the bowl of water. So I've been mopping up water because she steps in it, and she doesn't matter how wide or heavy the base is, she somehow manages to get in the water and slop it all around the kitchen floor. So I've been bending over and mopping up water quite a bit. And so this, the way that you bend over to clean the floor matters too. So it's much easier, again, to kind of take a wide stance, bend over, or to squat and to do the wiping up. And sometimes, that's a spontaneous action, but sometimes I go, oh, that kind of feels good. And then I'll squat like 4 or 5 more times, because in the course of the day, unless you're exercising, you may not be squatting and getting up. And it's a phenomenal activity, actually. It feels good to know that you can do that. It actually requires the ankle joints bending, the knees to bend, the hip joints to bend. Something has to happen with your spine and even the carriage of your head. So when you have the flow with all of those parts, it's an enjoyable activity that may be spontaneous.
A couple of things come to mind. And the first one, I was thinking about how Dr. Feldenkrais, before he was Dr. Feldenkrais, he was Moshe Feldenkrais, the martial artist in the Palestinian territories. And he worked as a laborer. He went to school there, and he practiced jujitsu. This is before he went to France and learned judo. He had a really unique approach. He was interested in people's spontaneous reaction to being attacked. And so he and a friend would startle somebody. His friend would have a camera. They'd take a picture of this person's reaction to being startled, and then use that as information on how to build a self-defense technique based on that. So I think that's really interesting in a couple of respects. It's taking a spontaneous reaction And then in a very Feldenkraisian way, taking that reaction and shaping it into something that was a self-defense technique. You can see Moshe's early thinking about these ideas and how they would eventually become the Feldenkrais method. And it's just a really interesting way to go about creating that kind of thing. And so that happens in Feldenkrais lessons all the time, so as I'm talking about.
Yeah, so that quality, or I guess it's a quality approach, it's not really a technique. It's relying on what we do spontaneously as human beings and then activating it. And Dr. Feldenkrais, through observations of himself and others, realized how to potentiate the nervous system with this particular aspect of human functioning and mind.
In lessons, like, we explore variations. We start with a basic movement, and people do it in the best way they can, the way that's most comfortable for them. And then we explore all kinds of different variations of that movement. And then something starts to happen. Then you start to have more choice about it. And out of having that choice, you start to have that sense of spontaneity, that you have more ways of doing that thing, whether it's bending or squatting like we're talking about, or reaching for something, or falling, or any number of these different things that we go through in life. We have more choice about it. And choice creates more spontaneity for us. We're less constrained in what we are able to do.
Mm-hmm. It made me think about Ruthie Alon and her book called Mindful Spontaneity. She was, as you know, a senior trainer. She worked directly with Dr. Feldenkrais for years, and she passed away recently. So, in her honor, I'd love to recommend her book. And she so beautifully describes spontaneous action that includes social, emotional responses. And when we think about ourselves socially, we were talking earlier, of course, about the consequences of our behavior socially, and how sometimes that inhibits our responses. So if we were to be spontaneous socially, and at the same time mindful, what would that look like? So it brings up, to me, the difference between being responsive or being reactive. So if we're reacting to someone socially, then there may be some kind of a trigger response that's not directly related to the person that we're with in that moment. We may be bringing a past experience forward and misinterpreting the current interchange. If we're being responsive, then we're fully present, mindfully so. We're responding to that person directly, not bringing the past forward. And this distinction between response and reaction is very useful to contemplate and to reflect on, so that we understand ourselves and how we are with people, how we are with ourselves.
That reaction that you're talking about could be, like you're saying, a past experience. It could be a rule somebody has, judgment they're making. It's really more of a compulsion. And I don't think we can go too far into spontaneity without bringing up the idea of compulsion. And that was one of Moshe's big ideas. He wrote a whole book about it, Potent Self, Study of Compulsion and Spontaneity. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, which is really interesting in that scenario you're talking about, and the person who's reacting, they don't have choice about that. It's just a reaction. And so it's more of a compulsion. Let's talk about what is a compulsion. We know for the extreme compulsions like OCD, what does OCD stand for?
Obsessive compulsive disorder.
That's right. And so that's like part of the brain that is just overactive all the time. People don't have conscious control over it. So that's like the extreme example of a compulsion: hand washing, checking doorknobs, the stove, all this stuff. And then there's the more subtle kinds of compulsion of not having choice in the way you go about moving. Like we talked about, reaching, falling, these other things, squatting, bending down. And if you only have, one way of doing that, it can lead to more injury, more discomfort, more strain. When we have more choice about it, you have more ease and more comfort, more ways of going about doing something. So there's a whole range of ways that we can be compulsive. And another is like the scenario you're talking about, the person who's reactive. Maybe they've got their parent in their brain criticizing them or criticizing this other person, and they're filtering it through that. That's another kind of compulsion. So there's all kinds of ways that we can have those kind of compulsive thoughts, behaviors, compulsive feelings all the time.
Yes, and those show up as certain patterns of behavior in movement and socially, emotionally. Some people, for example, when they're spoken to or a question is asked of them, their first response is no. We all know those kinds of people. And when you get to know somebody that responds that way, if you're self-possessed and are capable of doing so, you can wait and see that after they say no, they'll actually consider the request and they may come around and agree. But if you fight with them initially when they say no, chances are they're not going to agree later. So what do you think about that? There are no people. There are yes people and there are maybe people. And of course, it's not that black and white. People have some range. But I do know several people that respond with no first.
I know that too. And I've heard of people doing, I guess they call it a challenge. So say yes to everything. Whatever happens that day, you say yes to whatever comes along. Mm-hmm. Without filtering, without hesitating, you just go and you find out, where does it take you? I've never done that myself, but I say yes a lot anyway. Not always, but I'm pretty easy to get along with.
I actually have done that kind of an experiment, and I find that I feel much better. If I say yes, then I can consider the situation or my response in a different way than if I say no. And yes can lead to perhaps or maybe, or yes, I'll consider that, or yes, that's a possibility. All those things create an open sense in myself. No is like closing the blinders. Yes opens them. It's easier to take a breath with yes than with no. Can you feel that in your sense of yourself too?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. As you're describing that, I'm imagining different scenarios, and absolutely, you say the first reaction is no, you shut things down. Mm-hmm. And maybe people who do that just need a moment to process what they're feeling and what they want to have choice about it. And so they feel like saying no gives them an opportunity to process. And like you say, if you know somebody like that, and you just give them some time, usually they'll come around.
It's true. So there are so many different ways that we can change our patterns of behavior. And as we're describing now, by changing a word, you change your sense of self. You actually change your breathing. And I wonder if our audience is listening to themselves now and experimenting in their own minds, and maybe even noticing breathing. So let's all do that for a moment. Just notice your breathing. Notice when you breathe in. Notice when you breathe out in your own rhythm. And sense your face as you do that. As you notice your breathing, sense your eyes, your cheeks, your nose, your mouth. And as you're noticing yourself and shifting to this sensory state, imagine a friend or a loved one and say yes. Imagine that you're looking into their face and simply say yes to them. Observe your breathing, your sensations. And what are you noticing in yourself as you say yes to this person that's dear to you? And now let's do a little experiment. Continue to look into their face and say no. And sense your face also. Your whole self, your chest, your belly, say no. Notice your breathing and slowly come back to listening and still pay attention to yourself. You can have dual attention, as we call it, self and listening, self and other. And you can note to yourself what your response was. Would you like to share your response, Al?
Yeah. So I was imagining first that yes and no with my wife. Mm-hmm. And then the cat came into the picture for some reason. I was trying to think about the cat who often say, who wants to be fed? And I say, no. And she's like, yes. And so it's a lot easier if I just say, yes, sure, you can be fed. But, in both scenarios, though, the no was accompanied with, constriction in the face, especially around the eyebrows, the eyes, around my mouth. The yes, in both cases with my wife and with the cat, was like greater opening in my face, a softening in my face, my mouth, my breath was deeper. So, yeah, much more, I guess you'd say flow, openness, ease with a yes than to a no. And, with the fighting with the cat, you never win. So it's just easier to just say yes.
So this is an example of mindful spontaneity. We can actually prime our nervous systems to have a response that may be non-habitual, and it becomes a new habit. And the more that we bring our awareness to ourselves in this way, the greater the possibility of change. Because the motivation comes from understanding that it's creating something new and different that we might prefer, that could work with us well, socially, in our movement sphere. And so, listeners, if you're willing, play around with this and send us an email.
info@feldenkrais4life.com, and visit feldenkrais4life.com and check out our other podcasts. And please leave us a review on Apple.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah. See you later. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.